even if somebody else pisses you off, even if you can justify with your mind, well, no, it's their fault. That's why I'm all emotional. Even if you could justify that, still take responsibility for your own emotion.
Last week we were talking about the killing of Charlie Kirk. We had a good discussion about that, and I would say that the nation still is on edge. People are still anxious, especially with some of the subsequent actions regarding silencing of comedians and free speech. And we don't want to have a political discussion. We want to really take it from the lens of emotional dysregulation, how emotions play into our actions. We want to explore some of these themes. So we want to continue that discussion. And I know that you've been thinking about this last week, just as I think many of us have. And we want to help each other process what's going on, maybe de-escalate some of the tensions, and just try to have a productive and helpful discussion as we all try to work through this troubling time that we're in. So, with that kind of broad opening, do you want to kick us off with any thoughts that you have that you've come across, things that you've read or heard, and how you might want people to think about the situation we're in?
Yes. So, one, I want to say that we will address the comments like last time, but I noticed that because of my distractedness, I did not get to fully expand on things that I wanted to say because I was addressing the comments, and that's my responsibility. So we're going to address the comments at the very end of this. So we're just going to go keep talking, um, just have this conversation, and then anybody who wants to put a comment, you can. It's just understand that it won't be addressed to the very end. So that way, honestly, I won't get distracted and I'll be able to say what I want to say. So to summarize, you said like, what do you want to say in the beginning is yeah, I was really looking for a way for both parties in a disagreement, in a strong conflictual disagreement, to understand and give ourselves some kind of common understanding reference point um, that we can use to honestly temper ourselves. And that is what's in the book, which is generational trauma. And so generational trauma states if your family goes through a trauma, especially as children, and it's unresolved because they have to push the emotions of that trauma down, it gets passed into that child's offspring in the form of emotional dysregulation conditions and conditions with impulse behavior control, ADHD, autism, PTSD, bipolar, things like that. What that creates, though, is a very sensitive, defensive, volatile even because they're unable to control their impulses, personality. And if that again, doesn't get resolved and passed along, it just starts building. And so if you go through that, or your child goes through that, or you cause that in somebody else, if that happens to somebody else, it's guaranteeing that the next generations of human beings will be much more defensive, unable to relax, unable to let cooler minds prevail because they'll be very emotional and impulsive because of human genetics. And it's going to happen to both sides. It's going to happen as an entire species. And one of the main studies of generational trauma that's pretty famous is when they traumatized, unfortunately, that mouse to cherry blossom scents, and its offspring, as a result of that, became triggered to the scent of cherry blossoms. They automatically avoided them because of the smell, because they traumatized their mother. The other part of that study, though, that I heard was it took 13 generations of that original mouse's lineage to work that trauma out. 13 generations. I don't know how many generations is, and what is considered the average length of a generation in the human species? 25 years?
Something like that.
So it sort of makes sense that it seems to be every, what, 75 years that there seems to be a war, world war or something like that. So let's just start with there, and so you can just
Yeah,
comment.
actually, let me explain a little bit more because I think you've talked about it before, but for people who haven't listened to those or watched those previous videos or are not familiar with it, there was a study on mice. I think it was from Emory University about a decade ago. People just refer to it the cherry blossom study. So it's what you were just saying was that they subjected I think it was male mice actually
Hmm.
to where they would give them a mild shock and then also give them the smell of cherry blossoms. And so then they started developing that fear response. Like, okay, when they smell this thing, they get shocked. And so, but what was surprising from the study was that when those mice had babies, the baby mice actually also were triggered by that smell, even though they had never been shocked themselves. They exhibited that anxious behavior. It was passed on through the genes. So this is actually quite a landmark study for generational trauma. This is the scientific basis. I know that some commenters and some of the, other videos were asking, okay, what is the basis for some of the things that you're saying? That is the basis for it. If you Google it, you can find the paper on that. So this is quite significant because, as you've discussed, it talks about people who survived World War II. So, Jewish people who survived World War II tend to be the ones who are more anxious, and they pass that on to their children.
Right.
Okay, and so in that generational trauma, with the situation that we're in, people who are already anxious, who experience this, traumatic event where maybe Charlie Kirk is killed, they then are internalizing that differently than someone else might because they are perceiving this as a threat to their existence or a threat to their tribe. Can you talk about that more and how does generational trauma fit into that? Their anxiety, their fears, their emotions.
So yeah, when generational trauma in a lineage gives birth to a person that has mental health diagnoses that have, emotional dysregulation, impulse behavior control as a feature, you're basically creating like a jittery, more edgy, more nervous person, basically. And a person like that is going to be much more prone to seeing threats because that's what that mind now is edgy. It's designed to overcompensate and be way sensitive to threats in its environment. And as a person who is a generational trauma inheritor, that's the way my ego or person is. On the inside, I mean, on the outside, it may look like I'm calm, but on the inside, it feels like you're like a child that's constantly waiting for the next, who's going to victimize me next. And that, like, it didn't help that the trauma was also passed on experientially through abuse and stuff. So then that can happen again. So you pass along generational trauma two ways. One is genetic, but then the other one is if you don't understand what happened to you and you start abusing your child, now you passed it on also experientially. And so in me, it creates this feeling inside that you're like a jungle cat, you know, in the woods or in the jungle, like waiting and waiting, trying to be defensive and stuff like that. You're just much more edgy. So therefore, something happens out there that can be hundreds of miles away or in another country, and you'll feel a threat.
Yeah, so basically, in this analogy, you would be the baby mouse who smells the cherry blossom, and now you are very anxious. Whereas maybe my, parents were not subjected to that, mild shock with the cherry blossom smell. So when I smell cherry blossom, I don't get anxious. It doesn't trigger anything in me. So the Charlie Kirk killing, what's going on in society, that same event could be experienced in many different ways, depending on what happened to you, your previous, ancestors, etc. So that's a little bit where we have to understand that not everyone reacts to that same event the same way.
Well, yes, not every human being has the same brain, but you wouldn't act the whole biological fact of generational trauma and that genetic response. You are increasing the risk that the majority of your lineage is going to be like this. So yes, and what you talk about, like in order to really think about the consequences of your actions, it's really hard to do that when you're emotional, when you're too anxious. Like they say, that's why they say, let cooler heads prevail, temper the emotions, and you'll be able to have more harmonious thoughts. You'll be able to think of more solutions to a problem than just violence or seeing the other side as bad and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, the way I am, my brain with its sensitive emotionality and impulse behavior control, and the way your brain is, they're almost like polar opposite. And so, what I've had to do to resolve this is go through the entire protocol over and over and over again until a lot of that trauma energy was worked out and stuff.
Yeah. On this idea of letting cooler heads prevail, the basic challenge there is it doesn't satisfy that emotional need to respond. There's this emotional, there's a feeling. You feel fear, anxiety, rage, anger, whatever it might be. And so, because you have that feeling, for someone to say to you, hey, just chill out, just take it easy. What's the big deal? Don't let it bother you. That's not really helpful. That's not actually allowing them to address that emotion.
Yeah. And
Can you talk
I'll
about that
be
more?
honest with you. Yeah, I'll thank you for saying that. I'll be honest with you that so I I consider myself a pretty intense personality. And when I talk to friends even, I get the impression that when I'm giving an opinion on something, especially on current events or something like that, my emotionality comes out to the point where they're uncomfortable. And so I end up always hearing some kind of like, don't worry about it, or just do some meditation or something like that. And when you say something like that to somebody, like me, not everybody, obviously, but something like me, I have to get the emotion out. That's the way it's resolved. You have to let the emotion that's come up play out its full cycle. So in here, I get really irritated when an emotion comes up and I feel like I'm being squelched, like and I get really annoyed and stuff. And I do wonder why, like, why am I constantly being told, to chill out or something like that? And I realize like people are uncomfortable with the expressions of emotions that are coming out of you. But the problem now is I have to get it out. It's up, it's there and stuff. So it causes a conflict within me, which makes the anxiety actually worse, to tell you the truth. I get even more frustrated and angry if I can't express it once it's there.
Okay, let's talk about that because it's interesting. When you are emotional and you feel like someone's just saying, okay, just chill, just, take it easy. It feels like they're trying to squelch you. And your comment was, I think that they're uncomfortable with your emotions. Somehow they're not comfortable with that. Is the root issue that they also have emotions and they're not comfortable with their own feelings? Like if you are on edge and you are being aggressive or emotional and they're not comfortable with that, it's their lack of comfort, which is why they don't want to feel that way. And they're telling
Yes.
you, hey, just like
Because
chill
it's yeah,
out.
it's that whole you getting me nervous now. Calm down, Mike. Mike, you're getting me nervous now about this stuff. It's like that.
Yeah.
And
And so,
I have to admit, like the friends that I have, love them very dearly. They're like my support system and they're really important to me. And it's better, I can really relate to them because they're like me. So they've been
hmm.
through trauma. They have these kinds of emotional conditions in their own. So I know that they have edgy emotional systems themselves. So we're just triggering each other here and there. Yeah.
But then you have a better understanding when it's someone who's like you. So when you make an emotional statement and they're responding the same way and they have an emotional, response, you understand them. And therefore it's okay. You're friends, you're close, you trust each other. But if you're interacting with someone else and they're trying to squelch you and tell you to do something, just chill out or whatever, then you don't have that same connection. Therefore, you don't have the same level of understanding or empathy of what they might be feeling. Because intellectually, oh, they probably also are feeling uncomfortable with the way you are. And that's why they're responding that way. And yet, it's hard for you to then have that same, I guess, grace, the same empathy to let them, be aware of their emotions and give them
Yeah.
some
So,
space.
yeah, the way we're talking right here is a really good example of this. So, you said that your emotional system, the baseline is generally lower. I'm not going to say whether one is good or bad, but it's just generally lower, right? And so I sense in this whole conversation that you're able to have this kind of bird's eye view of two people going back and forth on it
Yeah,
like that.
more intellectual,
Yeah, like an
rational,
intellectual, rational
logical.
bird's eye view, though, but you can sort of see what's going on and try to help each side, the cooler head prevail kind of thing.
Hmm.
When you're more like this, you're more on the ground and you don't see yourself from a bird's eye point of view. You know, the an ego or a person that has the generational trauma in it and all these emotional dysregulation diagnoses is a very like closed in, defensive, like tight, like they're in their little castle, like their personality is like in the body, like in a little castle trying to defend it or feeling like it has to defend itself all the time. And so, yeah, it cannot, it's very, very hard to overcome getting a comment that triggers it from a stranger because
Hmm.
it's not designed to see that we're all one. It's designed to see threats. And this is what
Okay.
generational trauma does.
This makes total sense to me. Because people who are like that, they're closed in defensive, they're defending the castle. When someone makes a comment, even if it's well intentioned, it is viewed as or felt as a threat. It's an attack of some sort because that person's a stranger, because that person's from a different group, a different tribe, a different, demographic or whatever. It's not your friend. If your friend who you know and trust would have made the same exact comment, you may not have responded the same way as when a stranger, especially a stranger on the other side of the aisle, who has a different political view, makes that same exact comment. The way it's received by you is very different because
Yeah, it
it's a
can
threat
be,
versus
yeah.
not being
And
a threat.
and you're talking about the person on the other side saying something more peaceful, like, let's all calm down, let's chill out. They're trying to like work towards peace here. That's if that person on the other side is like that. A lot of times the person on the other side then starts arguing their point of view much more forcefully. Well, you guys did this, and you guys did that. And according to the Bible, that's wrong. And so then it causes, naturally, this is not a decision that you're making. When you have automatically an uptight, more overly sensitive nervous system, you're not making a decision to be much more defensive. Now you close in even more and get more tight. It's your biological survival mechanism is doing it for you. And if it's already has generational trauma in it, it's already reactive. This is why people like me, and when they say that our emotional responses sometimes are way beyond what the situation calls for. Like some little thing happened, you're like, whoa, 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 geez, it was just $5. Calm down. Or, all you did was just like stub your toe on the coffee table. Why are you acting like somebody shot you? Because I can't help it. It was like the nervous system was already designed that way
Mm.
and stuff. So you're not, just so what I'm asking everybody to do is don't do your best to look at this whole conflict from the point of view of God, from the godliness part, from the point of view of universal energy, from the peaceful presence, because God doesn't see just one generation. The egoic mind, especially one that's defensive like this, it only really can see its life, its family, its tribe, its home. It can't even see past 3 generations what this is going to do, right?
Mm.
God sees the entire thing. And so God knows you do this now, so we were talking about this earlier, a good line from the Bible that people always use, well, an eye for an eye, you know, an eye for an eye. Yes, that's it in the Bible, an eye for an eye. However, maybe what they meant was if you do something to take somebody's eye over there, somebody's going to want to take yours. Maybe that's what God was saying. Maybe that's what the Bible was saying, not as you was saying that not as an instruction. It was saying that as a warning.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say that in the Bible, or in the Old Testament, eye for an eye was meant to provide some guidance so that people would not, so the justice would be proportionate. Like if you took someone's eye, you don't kill that person, you take their eye. And so it was a way maybe of trying to manage people's response. But then in the New Testament, they talk about turning the other cheek, where instead of returning the same anger, hatred, or harm back to the other person, if you turn the other cheek, then you can end that cycle of violence. You can reframe that situation in the relationship so that you're
Yeah.
both better off.
Yeah. So a way with the understanding that we just talked about with the cherry blossom study, a way to turn the other cheek is even if somebody on the other side kills somebody and you take it really hard, it's like somebody in your own family dies and you're really, really sad, then you get angry and you want to retaliate. You want to do eye for an eye. Well, an eye for an eye states we should do the same thing over there then. A way to turn the other cheek is to remember you do something like they already did something to enact a trauma in you. As a result of that, if you can't resolve this trauma, you may do something to them and it's going to cause this whole generational trauma line to continue. An uptight, edgy, defensive personality is a personality that's ready for a fight all the time and stuff. And you're just creating generations and leagues of this in both sides. So that's, so turning the other cheek is to remember that, like, okay, let's not enact the entire biological response of genetic, generational trauma. Because that's why, like I said, there's wars in the human species every 75 years or so, and then it gets to the point where, and I've heard this many, many times, well, there's always going to be a bad guy. We have to be like this. Or war is just the way humankind is. And then we just accept it as the way it is, and thus it never stops because you can't see a solution out of it.
Yeah. And this whole idea of like, how do you turn the other cheek? I think part of the reason why we respond in kind is because we have a very strong point of view. We believe we're right. We've been harmed, or our family, our group has been harmed. And this emotion translates to a feeling, oh, I need to get justice. I have this righteous anger. You know, my friend was harmed. My group was attacked. If you understood the context of what was going on, there might be more nuance. There might be more other factors that are at play, which created that event. But we look at it from a very narrow perspective. We don't take into account because there's no way for us to know everything else that happened to lead to that event. And therefore, we reduce it to the very simple black and white, good and evil, good and bad. That's sort of a like kind of a dualistic. You're either this or you're that. You're either in my
Yeah,
group,
because
you're out of
yes,
my group.
so yeah, when once a person is born from generational trauma because their family's gone through a trauma that's already edgy and nervous like that. And so when it gets triggered, it easily within milliseconds goes into survival mode. And I talked about this last week in the little talk that I had, the weekly talk that I had, that a brain in survival mode gives you very little options to resolve a conflict and a problem because all it wants to do is eliminate the trigger. That's all it's trying to do because the survival mode, the physiological response of the survival mode, I mean, that's a really polite way to put it. There are no words to really describe what that feels like. You can only use a comparison. When I say physiological response of a survival mode, it's as if somebody broke into your house with a large knife and is chasing you. That's the feeling inside. And
Yeah.
so your mind will not be able to give you, if that's the way you feel about somebody that's 300 miles away, you will not be able to access more harmonious thoughts, more thoughts about consequences. Your mind will just want to eliminate the trigger, thus violence, war.
Yeah. And actually, the idea that if you feel threatened, another group, another individual is threatening you, it makes sense that you would dehumanize that other group.
Hmm.
You would make them lesser. They are somehow not worthy because then your actions toward them are justified. They're not
Yeah.
human. They don't have
I,
the same rights.
yeah. Again,
Uh,
dehumanize is a good term. I mean, dehumanize is a good term, but it's a very polite term. Dehumanize means you've now put them in the same category as like an animal, meaning like, squirrel or something. You can do that now because in your mind, they're not even the same species as you. So
yeah.
yeah, that's why. So saying things like they're evil. What do you get in the Bible? What are you allowed to do to an evil person? What does God do to an evil person? God punished them lots of times with violence. So it's very easy for a mind that's already uptight, you know, to say, well, I have to eliminate the trigger. They're evil because they're causing it. And therefore, in the Bible, God punishes evil people. We can do that. Actually, God is working through me to punish that evil person. And now the logic is sound, but they don't even. So this is one thing I want to talk about. In our human culture and society, when you have this kind of generational trauma that builds up like that, in my opinion, it does not respect enough the power that emotions have over people. Our society is built on not really taking into account the power of emotions. That's why our economic society is really like, if you're able to push your emotions down, keep working, keep, doing what you do 50, 60, 70 hours a week with very little emotional backing up on you, you will be rewarded. A person like that can push down their emotions and keep going, is rewarded. A person who can't do that, they're too emotional, too impulsive, they can't seem to keep a job, they can't seem to work long hours, they're not rewarded. They're going to suffer economically in this society. So it just shows you right there that you don't value enough the emotions in this whole thing, and we don't pay attention to it enough, and thus it gets the better of us.
Yeah. And you also mentioned this last time or in a previous session where you were talking about how you would want a leader of your company, if you're working at a company, to be a rational, like thoughtful person, not to be in charge of their emotions, not to swing wildly from one decision to the next. So it makes sense from a capitalist, corporate America perspective that you want people who are calm, rational. They're thinking about this, from a logical perspective. And it is not human nature to necessarily always think that way.
No, it's you're relying upon, what percentage of the population is that can be so calm and rational and cool under pressure that they can do this. That's why, the people at the top, there's so few of them. And I should say this, what I would really want actually, yes, is a person like that, but they also understand, what it's like when you're not like that and when you have these kinds of emotions. So they also have empathy and compassion for a person who's not like them. Or maybe they went through that themselves, resolved that, so they're not like that anymore. And so they are in this position of leading others, but with the experience of what it was like when they were having problems like that, but they were able to resolve them so they can have empathy and compassion. I know what that's like to be like that.
Yeah. And in the case of what's happening right now in current events, where Charlie Kirk was assassinated or killed, where comedians are being silenced and taken off the air, it's difficult to have empathy or compassion if you have a certain point of view and the other side, quote unquote side, is doing something which you cannot understand because you didn't live the lives they lived, or you don't experience the world they experience it. You don't watch the media they watch. And therefore, it's really hard to have this rational, reasonable approach to understanding the situation.
It's impossible. I would say it's impossible. So so I did some research last night on my own emotional system, and I went into, comments sections of what would be considered the opposite side and stuff. This body that genetically inherited ADHD, autism, PTSD. It's that whole, generational trauma, edgy, emotional, defensive personality body. And of course, what happened? All of this fear came up, all of this anxiety came up, like exactly what I thought would happen. The ego became much more like defensive in its position, began to, be much more protective. And then in that mode, it can only see threats and only want to eliminate them. So it began to not be able to see human beings. And the thought was, my goodness, there's no common ground. Like, we're in trouble as a species, as a people, as a country. Like, there's no common ground once you start seeing things from this point of view that I was seeing things. I triggered it in myself. And knowing that this was going to happen, I just wanted to see it happen with all the meditation work that I do, with all of the book that I wrote, all this whole thing about resolving your trauma and your emotions and all. When I go in there, it can still happen like that. I feel very blessed that I was shown somehow another way to resolve that without having to vilify another side and do something volatile to them. There's another way to resolve this thing. I feel blessed in that respect because if I didn't have that knowing, that understanding from my own meditation work, my own spirituality work, I'd be like right there on the front lines fighting.
Yeah. What's interesting about this is that when you have that emotional reaction, I think it's a little bit of your ego that wants to defend its body, defend its group. It wants to be right. It wants to be good. And then it creates this binary perspective. Okay, if I'm good, I want to believe that I'm good. I want to believe that I'm right. Therefore, you must be wrong. You must be evil. You must be the threat. So the ego, just naturally creates such a dichotomy, such a dualistic perspective to
Yeah.
protect itself.
Yeah. It's like okay, so think of it like, say, I'm trying to use analogies here. Thinking of the ego like the firewall of a computer system. It's designed to defend, isn't it? That's what a firewall does. So
Right.
you enact the
Keeps threats
firewall.
out.
Yeah, it
Hmm.
keeps threats out. So the ego is like that. It does a lot of other things, like, it helps you to remind you that you're hungry so you can get groceries and put gas in the car and stuff. But one of the main functions is it protects the body. And so you enact the firewall system of that person. What do you think is going to happen? The firewall is designed to do that. So everything that you're talking about that the ego is doing, it's not wrong. It's not wrong at all. It's designed to do that. You're enacting it, so you enact the firewall in this system. Of course, it's going to do that.
Yeah. You know what's amazing is that we humans, with our egoic minds, have created groups, organizations, political parties, advocacy organizations, different collections of human beings who are like-minded, who now become part of your group, part of your tribe, who are fighting for a certain idea, a certain principle, a certain, vision or whatever it might be. And therefore, your membership in that organization requires you to continue to uphold that perspective. That has become your identity. You self-identify as a liberal, as a conservative, gun rights activist, choice advocate, whatever it might be. And therefore, if you're not fighting for the cause, it feels like you are betraying your tribe. You are not fulfilling your obligation to the group to defend it. So it's a little bit of the individual egoic mind, which has been then aggregated into a organization, into a movement, where people now feel they must perpetuate, fight for their idea. That's existential to that organization, to their identity as a member of that organization.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with this is how life is. I mean, I'm pretty sure people are listening to this going, yeah, so. Like, so there's nothing wrong with that. But if you take the internal emotional temperature of everyone and every organization and turn it up 20 degrees, now everything is getting heated. Those lines are going to be much more drawn in the sand. The person's going to be, each organization is going to be blinded as to, they're just going to start defending themselves a lot more. And what's I always think is interesting is when you said the liberal side, stuff like that. We're about the side of inclusion. We're about the side of like d diversity and inclusion. But can you include someone who doesn't want to include? You know, can you show someone tolerance or acceptance to someone who doesn't tolerate? And in order to resolve this, look at this in yourself. That's what I had to do. That there was a part of me that was full of hatred so much, but I knew to heal, if you want to call it that, or resolve, you had to unconditionally love and embrace every part of yourself. But can you do that to a part that doesn't want to love? It doesn't want to embrace. It wants to hate because it's the energy of hatred and the generational trauma has been passed into it. And you have to be able to allow that to express itself. And so, can we tolerate and include those who do not want to tolerate and include? Because if you can't, well, now, you're not following through on what you say that you're doing.
Yeah. Can I maybe take us off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's relevant. When we think about the conflict that we have right now, different points of view, not understanding each other, etc. One question to ask ourselves is why are we fighting for these ideas? What is it that we're trying to achieve? And I would say both sides, and many people just have a certain view of the world. So we're trying to create the society that we think would be better. Both sides believe that they're fighting for a better society. And so this then triggers my thought of, okay, how do you define what would be a more just, harmonious society? Like, what would that society look like? For people who are familiar with philosophy, John Rawls has a theory called the veil of ignorance. It's basically this idea, it's a thought experiment where you say, okay, imagine that you have no identity, place in society, black, white, male, female, straight, gay, transgender, whatever it is. So without any of that information, create a society that you think would be equitable or that you would want to live in. And so, in such an experiment, that is then the basis for how you might have laws or rules or a justice system. The challenge that we have is that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to your point, to imagine ourselves as a different individual. I am Asian, I am male, etc. And therefore, I see the world with that lens. I am the product of everything that I've experienced. If you happen to be a white male and you were in the dominant group, it's hard for you to imagine yourself being an African American woman or single mother or something. And therefore, your idea of a society of what you think would be best is colored by and informed by what you lived. But other people don't have that experience. They grew up in a very different circumstance, and therefore their idea of what we're fighting for or that just harmonious society is very different. And this can cause problems and conflict because we just don't understand each other. We don't understand other perspectives.
And then when you start to do that, and it happens over several generations and conflicts happens, it's very easy for the mind to say, well, that's just the way it is. And then it just continues. And how many times have you heard that? That's just the way it is. I guess we were always in war. Okay. Get ready. Like, and so I feel when you talk about this whole society that you're trying to create, I feel a society like that needs to include a way to resolve the generational trauma in there. Because you also said the word veil. What was it? You said veil. What was the thing called?
It's called the veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance is, in my opinion, when the emotions that power your mind, your ego, your personality become too intense, it becomes a veil. And so a functional, an ego or a person that's able to create this kind of society in which, we're all trying to be as inclusive as possible and work towards common goals as much as possible. A personality like that needs to be a veil like these curtains here. Like, so if you think of the curtain as the personality of the person in which they're seeing the lens, you could still see through it. You can see that it's a veil. You can be able to see, okay, this is my identity. I'm Asian, da da da, da, and I was raised this way, but I could see that it's a veil. I could see it's the way my mind is like thinking through this veil like this. And the reason that I'm able to do this, though, is because my emotions aren't that intense, or at least I have a way to de-escalate the emotions. When things are calmer, cooler heads prevail, and your veil becomes like this. When you're too emotional, your veil, the curtains, become like blackout curtains. You can't get any light through it. You can't see through it at all. And so there needs to be a way to de-escalate the emotions individually for each of us. Because if you then just rely on the mind to de-escalate the emotions and it's all already affected by this strong, anxious, intense, anxious veil, it's going to go into survival mode, eliminate the trigger, which is eliminate the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It is about your perspective. It is about your perception of your situation and society, things that are around you. And that's why I think that if we could have the ability to see the world from another perspective or other people's perspectives, we would have more empathy, So we have
It's
empathy for
impossible. It's
people.
it's not impossible. It's really hard to do that. So think about something simple like somebody cuts you off in traffic. It almost kills you. It goes right in your car. You have to like even when slam on the brakes or readjust your car. That whole situation just caused a trauma in your body. The fear response goes up, the anxious. This is why there's so much road rage, right? It goes up in the body. As a result of that, you no longer are able to see that that person may be in another situation altogether. Maybe he's rushing his wife to the hospital because they're in labor, or maybe, you know, um, yeah, maybe they're rushing to something that because there's a real problem and stuff, but you
Hmm.
don't care. You've been triggered, and now that whole state puts you into this whole defensive mode, and you call that person a jerk. You don't have no idea what that, person's life is and what's going on with them and stuff. Um, and then you might even say, well, it doesn't justify them driving like that. You won't even be able to like, yeah, I understand what you're saying and all, but it doesn't justify them driving like that. It can hurt people. So you still feel justified in
Yeah.
like calling them a jerk.
Yeah, this is a difficult situation because if you were in that situation where your loved one is dying and you need to get to the hospital now, you would probably drive erratically. You might cut people off. This is exactly the issue is that we're not able to put ourselves in that other person's, position. We don't even try. I think maybe that's the problem. We don't even stop to think, oh, what's going on with that other person? Why might they be acting a certain way? Why might they be responding a certain way? And if we just did that, I think we would go a long way towards having better conversations, having a better understanding of each other, resolving some of these conflicts. It's unnecessary to have the conflict if we
And
just
that,
had a little more empathy.
and I think that, like I said earlier, your emotional baseline that you're working with is lower. And so if someone would cut you off in traffic, and even if you got a little anxious, maybe it would go up to here.
Mhm.
So if you're resolving generational trauma in your body, which many, many, many bodies are, their baseline of emotions up here.
Right.
And say when it gets to this point, reason goes out the window. You're not able to see. You go into a whole tribal survival mode. So now you're already starting out at a baseline that's a little bit edgy compared to you. And then the person cuts you off in traffic. It goes above here. Now it's gone past the line, which your mind is able to see. They might be experiencing their own problems and stuff like that. It can't see that. It's gone to such a high anxious state that goes into survival mode. So again, to me is all about we have to value and respect the power that emotions have over that and learn ways to de-escalate it for ourselves individually. Because what's seen so much in this society is that people making other people responsible for my feelings. That's what
Hmm.
you see a lot. We have to have a way to de-escalate for ourselves and manage for ourselves your emotions. Otherwise, you're going to get triggered all over the place and start making people responsible for you all over the place. This happens within a family. This happens. Forget about another side. How many times do you talk to family members, cousins, friends, stuff like that? Then you realize, oh, wow, he doesn't like his brother. Wow, they don't like their mother. They're living in the same house. Wow, that husband and wife team is having a hard time. Like even like in the most basic unit of society, a family, we have problems doing that and make the other person responsible for your feelings, even if it is caused by somebody's negligence and not thinking it through that, because they were only thinking about themselves, they did something and it triggered an anger in you or a frustration in you, you can easily justify it's your fault. You could say that because you didn't think about da 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 da, and that's what happens all the time. It happens
Yeah.
all the time. Even if that happens, you need to have find a way to be able to resolve this emotion in yourself, so you don't end up talking like that to that person. Because what usually happens, I would say over 50% of the time, you talk like that to that person, what happens? They get defensive. Well, I was just doing this, and you did that last week to me. You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I was going to say that your emotional state carries on through your interactions apart from that particular thing that triggered you. So you have a bad day at work, your boss is saying something, your colleagues are saying something, or whatever it might be, and you're angry or you're annoyed or you're whatever, you have anxiety. And then you go home and what do? You self-medicate, you drink, you might, argue with your partner, you might yell at your kids. Your kids didn't do anything to you. It's because have this emotion that was not resolved and you're taking it out on the kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, think about the thing with the mice. So in my opinion, so when he said experiment with the mice, it took 13 generations to work that trauma out in the mouse. So one could speculate almost the entire human population is in some form of dealing with generational trauma. Who knows what generational line you're in from the original trauma of Vietnam or World War II or 9/11 or something. Who knows? Like you probably, what, third, fourth, fifth generation, you're still waiting all the other generations to work this thing out. So what I'm saying is when you're like that and you're dealing with generational trauma in an edgy nervous system, there's very little ramp up sometimes. Like
Yeah.
you don't need much to get you edgy.
Can I just say a word on that? Because I think that we continue to subject ourselves to trauma whenever we continue to consume media and polarizing reports and things that get our emotions all worked up. That is just making the situation worse. So if you already are nervous, if your system, your body is already on edge, watching that kind of content's probably not helping you. It's probably just upping the anxiety level, creating an even greater state of threat or fear. So just be
Yeah.
aware that you're doing this to yourself if you continue to consume that content because social media companies are trying to get you to engage, get you to comment, spend more time on their platform, etc.
Yeah, and just be aware of that again, these are animalistic bodies. They're designed to respond in certain kinds of ways. Generational trauma is one of them. Another way to look at it is addictions and stuff. So they're finding now that a human brain, looking at it objectively, whether liberal or conservative, a human brain can get addicted to its own neurochemicals of anger, of
Hmm.
adrenaline, of rage. And you've seen that sometimes, like I've heard people say, sometimes that is, you get into the fight because you just want to let it out and it feels so good. And so I've met people like this. I was like this. And
Yeah.
so that's a biological, when I say addicted, I mean you experience those kinds of chemicals in your brains with those emotions so much, it gets to the point where the brain, it creates a stasis in the brain, meaning it now needs that kind of neurochemical level of anger and adrenaline to feel normal.
Yep.
And then you go into social media. You said, the part of social media addictive. What people always talk about, as we're doing social media and we're trying to build our website and our presence, is the algorithm. They're always talking about like you got to work with the algorithm so it pushes your video out. And so the algorithm is not designed to help people stay mentally balanced. The algorithm is not designed to balance out your emotions. The algorithm is designed to give you more of what you get off on. And
Hmm.
that is the neurochemicals of your emotions, the adrenaline, the anger. I would assume that a little bit of dopamine is released as a result of that. And so
Yep.
once the algorithm realizes these types of videos gets this person off, it's going to start feeding you more and more and more of this stuff, which is why, as much as I'm this meditation teacher and I do all this, be the peace stuff, if I put myself in that situation and enact the biological response of this body, it makes sense that my neurochemical, addiction would start up based on the algorithm.
Yep. And I was going to say that um, something you've said previously is the ego prompts the body to take action. So if you have this feeling of anger, outrage, you're under attack, you're threatened, that state then spurs the body to release these chemicals, adrenaline and maybe dopamine. And especially if you feel like you're under attack or under threat, it makes you feel more powerful. It makes you, bond with people around you who are like-minded for survival. That is like a biological mechanism to get you to take action. And so these social media companies have just harnessed this for their own,
Yeah. A quick,
purposes.
and remember, like it's bringing up these neurochemicals for a quick burst of action. Meaning, like if you had to run from a cheetah or something like that, you can run, but everybody knows you can't do a flat out fast as you can run for very long. Same thing with a fight. Your body can't stay in this kind of heightened cortisol-ridden adrenaline state for very long. It's designed for a quick burst. When you stay in that, though, it starts to break your body down. The stress of it's going to start to break your body down.
That's exactly right. And this, chronically being in that state is not good for you. You need to have that downtime. You need to feel safe and secure. You need to be maybe bored, let the body be in that safe space so that you can process your emotions, so that you can, there's some biological things that have to happen, but you're always under threat. Your body is using its energy to survive, to respond to the threat, to be
Yeah.
ready to fight or
Yeah.
flee.
And then from there, it's very, very easy for the mind to just stay in its tribe and not look at the other side. In such a heightened state of adrenaline rush, cortisol rush, anger rush that, and the goal of a mind like that is just to eliminate the trigger. Therefore, let's all huddle together and look at the other side and vilify them on both sides. So yes, and what the suggestion here is like we almost need to schedule in our time. If you know that you're on your phone like doing this kind of stuff, I mean, on both sides, in my opinion, when you isolate yourself with a phone like this and only look at one kind of information the algorithm keeps feeding you, you know what also does that is a cult. That's
Hmm.
how cults can get people into their, and I'm not trying to make any one side the bad guy here. It's just what happens in cult like initiation is they isolate you and they keep feeding you one kind of information. The whole idea of staying on social media and having the algorithm feed you what you get off on has that effect. And so if you realize this is happening to you and you don't want to go into war and cause generational trauma for generations and end up like some Middle East conflict or something like that, you should schedule time away from the phone. This is what I schedule time like away from the algorithm, not social. Don't think of social media as bad, evil. All these companies are bad and evil. Just the algorithm is designed this way. Stay away from the algorithm. Relax your mind for like, daily for like an hour or two. That and from that space where you're more relaxed now and your mind is not hyped up from the algorithm, do your best to then look at the other side. I I was a drug counselor and a lot of my clients were on the other side of the political spectrum. And I got along with them great. Why? Because we weren't talking about that stuff. We were talking about our addiction recovery and we had to connect. And I found that even if they had political views or the exact opposite of me, these were good people. These were people that were scared. They were nervous. They were emotional, but I got along with them great. I mean, these were, and same with me. We respected each other a lot. Sometimes I remember one time I had a political argument with somebody, totally in the opposite end. Session was over, left my office. A few seconds later, he comes back in and says, "I'm really, really sorry about that. I didn't mean to say anything disrespectful, man. I just, I really appreciate what you do and stuff like that. And I really think we're like, we're good friends and stuff like, so I didn't mean anything by that." When do you hear that?
Hmm.
Like, so from that space where you're in a cooler mind that's prevailing, interact with somebody from the opposite side that way. Interact with your friend who's like that and stuff. So you get to see them as a person live, hopefully. Have lunch with them. So you're not just seeing the other side in this social media where they're all hyped up on their neurochemicals. You're all hyped up on yours, and your mind is now trained to see them as the enemy. Take some time away from the algorithm, let your cooler mind come out, and then interact with that person. But and go to lunch with them. Go to lunch with them and stuff and talk
Yes,
to them.
on this idea of reducing exposure to the algorithm, I think this is especially important for people who have neurodivergent traits. So if you have autism, ADHD, as you said, your brain, your mind has evolved or adapted to trauma, to chaos, to danger, to unsafe environments. And so you're always on edge. And therefore, you are especially maybe prone to getting sucked in by the algorithm, because it it,
Yeah,
it
I
triggers
am.
you.
I am. Yeah, because it can really the whole social media thing in your phone can really be insidious. And I'm not trying to say it's evil. For a lot of people who are edgy like this, their phone relaxes them actually. Like the distraction because they're already stressed out. When they go on their phone, it calms the system down because it's a distraction. Maybe you look at sports. Okay, it's relaxing. Or maybe you're looking at funny videos, just series of cat videos that are funny and you're laughing. So it can really, bring you in that way innocently. But then from there, you keep scrolling and then you get to the political stuff. And then you're already been there for like an hour and then you just start keep going with it and stuff. So, and I'm trying to say is like, I think, let me just, we really need a way to pay attention to how do you de-escalate the emotions on your own. So we can't stop people from being on their phone. We can't stop people from getting caught up in this stuff. However, and having their emotions get really caught up in this stuff. However, if people realized, according to human biology, you have now enacted the whole, fight flight mechanism. You can feel it. Your heart's beating, you're getting all riled up, stuff like that. I have to then go into this de-escalation mode when I'm done. Something where I like, I have to cool the mind down to let its cooler head prevail, kind of thing. Each time you do that and stuff. So if there's a way to do that, fine. Because that's the way this body is. This body, it can get addicted to things and have those chemical rushes really easily. The difference is once you work through the emotions like that on your own using the protocols in this account and all, you can get back to your cooler head. And there's one more thing that I did want to mention. I know that we're close to the end of the time, but I did want to mention this because a lot of the times what people use to argue their point, this country being Christian, is the Bible. Both sides, all the time. Like when people quote the Bible, I'm thinking now, like, did you actually read the entire thing on its whole to see the whole message, or were you going through the Bible and circling passages and underlining because you knew I can win an argument with that one? Yeah, when that person says that, oh, here's another one. Good. And now you're just, all you've done is just highlighted and circled and kept on post-it notes all the things that you can use as to defend yourself without reading the entire thing, really. I do that. I like so, and both sides would do this. So what's interesting though, there's a scholarly paper that was written. You can Google this and find it, but scholars have written on generational trauma in the Bible. And when you look at it from this perspective, the entire Bible, Old Testament to the New Testament, is the story of generational trauma. Because in the whole story of the Bible, Jesus is the generational line of all the people in the Old Testament. I think from Abraham through Solomon through David all the way to Jesus, right? And so they're telling this generational storyline. All the people in the Old Testament that was before Jesus, or in the Old Testament, Abraham, Solomon, David, people like that. When you read some of the stories in there, like David took another man's wife as his own, had that man killed. Later on, one of David's sons raped his half sister. Um, one of Abraham's grandchildren, took his brother's wife as his own wife. They were doing these traumatic things to each other. King Solomon, the wise, had 700 wives and 300 concubines. These are all stories that you could find in the Bible, but they don't really teach this stuff. We remember the highlights like David and Goliath and Solomon the wise. You just pass over all the other stuff. But these are all traumatic things that people in Jesus's line did. That's all documented on through this. I mean, it could be a myth, yes, but it's the story, it's the symbolic story of generational trauma. It then gets to Jesus. It gets to the point where in the Bible, this is the way it goes. God says, yes, you're doing this and you're my people and all, but I'm really unhappy. And it's gotten to the point where you've lost sight of heaven. You can't get into heaven anymore. I have to send down my only son as this covenant between you to save you. Right. And so you could take that literally, or you could take that in terms of generational trauma. When you start doing traumatic things like that so much, let's go back to the veil. Your veil of your ego being thinner and being able to see it for what it is becomes opaque when you keep doing things that enact this trauma response in you, and you can't see the godliness of everything. We can't see that in the end we all come from the same God, the same image, the same, well, the same energy, really. I mean, everybody has godliness within them. There's different names for it, but everybody has godliness in them, this presence of God in them. Buddha nature, Christ consciousness, the peace that surpasses all understanding. Different religions have different names for this. It's all the same thing. But when your emotions are too hyped up, you can't see that. And so my opinion is Jesus came in there and showed everyone a way to thin the veil out again. And therefore, it's not as opaque. And that way of thinning out the veil was resolving the emotions. You resolve the emotions when you feel them, you give them up, you bring them up in the body and you give them up to God, and God takes them from you. That's how you resolve the emotions on your own. Even if somebody did something to you to trigger the emotion, you don't go after the person. You go through this process of giving up the emotion to God. You give it, God receives it. The word for that in the Lord's Prayer is forgive. The origin of the word forgive us our trespasses, from the Lord's Prayer means to give and God receives. So maybe Jesus was showing people a way to resolve the generational trauma energy on their own. So they didn't have to keep on, you know, enforcing and moving this generational trauma thing over and over and over like that. And thus, that was the source of salvation for a lot of people. Maybe, I don't know. You can look at it literally, or you can look at it like that and stuff. So I just want to put that out there because a lot of times people use the Bible. We're all Christian, understandably. I'm not saying Christianity is bad or anything, and they use the Bible, but we use the Bible against each other. When you look at it from the generational trauma point of view, and look at everybody like that, that whole Bible is the story of generational trauma, and this person named Jesus possibly showing a way to stop all that madness.
That's great. So my takeaway from this whole discussion is that in these anxious times, let's remember we're all in it together. We have a lot more in common than we have differences. And if we just could take our emotions down a notch, I think we could better see what binds us together. And then we would all live probably a smoother and happier life.
Yes, and I would add to that, thank you. And I definitely agree, and I would add to that, take the emotions down a notch by learning things to do it on your own. Even if somebody else pisses you off, even if you can justify them with your mind, well, no, it's their fault. That's why I'm all emotional. Even if you could justify that, still take responsibility for your own emotions. Because again, think about the driver that's cutting you off and all. You don't know if they did that intentionally to you. But when you get pissed at somebody like that, the mind automatically thinks they did, or at least they were so negligent that they didn't think about you. You don't know what's going through their head and stuff. And so learn to de-escalate the emotions because not everybody's pissing you off intentionally. A lot of times they're not. They're just trying to survive. They're just trying to live their lives. But when you're coming from a hyped up emotional state and you don't know how to resolve your own emotions, now everything is like they did that to me. They didn't necessarily. Parents do this to children. Children, we do this in our own families. My brother did something to piss me off. My mother did this to me. If you can learn to resolve your own emotions and bring more peace to your own family, then as a species, we have a fighting chance.
Okay. That's a good
Fighting
place to
chance.
end
That's
on a
funny that I said that. We have a fighting chance.
let's end it on a positive note, even if it's somewhat violent.
Yeah.
Thanks for the conversation.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And I was looking at there wasn't any really comments that no one was asking any questions there, so we didn't have to address the comments, so we're good with that. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.